stakeholders. And then maybe after each panel member has had a chance to speak, we'll also give audience members to talk. Not necessarily to ask questions, unless you have questions, but also just to talk and to participate. Mr. Gotiana. Where's the mic? You are the first.
Yeah, can I stand here?
You can be seated, I think it would be better, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson and my leader. I call you my leader because we're coming from a past where in those days you were one of those leaders that were a beacon of hope to our people. And we're still yearning for leadership of your caliber, even today, so that we could be led in a way that will usher in hope to our people.
Thank you.
Good morning to everybody, and protocol observed. I thought that before I could even consider coming to this platform, I think it was important for us within the sector to look at the issues that are currently prevailing in our country. And I thought that to follow an academic fashion type of a presentation won't help. But I think it is important and of essence that somebody must speak from their heart. And I'm going to be doing that exactly. I here represent broader civil society. I'm part of the Nedlec Community Constituency. I'm part of the broader civil society network. And when we received this invitation, Program Director, we felt that I think it is important and incumbent on us as a sector that indeed we play our role. And the first thing that we do was to look at the recommendations and look at what is actually happening in the country. And there are two fundamental issues that we think they underpin what we want to achieve in our country. This just energy transition plan, it must underpin sustainable development. Two, it is imperative that it must be within the confines of social justice. Without those two fundamental elements, it will defeat the whole purpose of the Presidential Climate Commission to come up with something tangible for the country. Because one, we are talking here of how do we want to see electricity planning going ahead in our country. And I think critical to that are questions that must be answered. And I think it is up to this platform to come up with proper direction of if we're saying that the future electricity planning in the country is needed, under whose auspices that must be led. In other words, which governmental department must look into that? And two, who is going to be implementing that? Today, we've got a crisis in our country. If we say that it's going to be ESCOM, yes, ESCOM is good, but is the current ESCOM a fit-for-purpose entity that will be able to fulfill that obligation? And I think these are some of the questions that we need to answer today so that the minister can follow a direction given by this platform. That's one. Two, we must look into other contexts which are happening in the country. The issue of climate constraints, the issue of socio-economic imperatives. Because I think, as the program director was already saying, that in other areas, if we're saying we're transitioning to a renewable energy space, what's going to happen with the coal value chain, okay? Because remember the coal value chain, it is where most of our people, are employed. It is where the poor, it is where the working class, they find joy. So we must look into those imperatives. And the other thing that is important for us that we must consider, what should be the role of the local government, the municipalities? What role must they play going forward? Because I think we are seeing some deficiencies within municipalities. The issue of admin, the issue of a skills base, the issue of a political will to ensure that things do happen in the country. And these are some of the realities that confront the country, which we think are very, very much imperative. So it therefore means that municipalities must play a critical role. The effects of COVID-19, everybody knows what COVID has ravaged our communities. It has caused so much harm to our people. So many people have lost their job. So what are we saying about the low-income, households? People who don't have, the means, to procure or to buy, just a token of electricity in our communities. So the issue of a free basic services, is required. Now, that kind of service must be addressed by the local municipalities. With the kind of challenges that are confronting municipalities, are they going to be able to fulfill that obligation? What are they going to be doing in ensuring that they do things in a way that will be advantageous to our people? So that's the kind of issues that we think are very, very important. So in the nutshell, Chairperson, what you are saying as civil society, we are very much happy with the recommendation. We support them 100%, but we feel that it should be within a restructured ESCOM. There should be a proper intergovernmental relationship. All these departments must work in unison so that they could fulfill the obligation that is required in the country. And last but not least, we need really to ensure that the just energy transition, is invested on our people. Human resource component must be looked in, ensure that we promote, women, youth, disability, all those sectors. The SMEs, they also to form part of the whole thing. It should encapsulate all those sectors so that it becomes one stronger issue that will address the challenges confronting the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's try to stick to about 5 minutes. I won't be too strict, the speakers. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Program Director and Chairperson of the session. May I equally take the opportunity to say hello, to say hearty greetings from ourselves as organised labour to fellow panellists, the esteemed ministers in the forum here today, and likewise to fellow members, fellow comrades, colleagues, etc. Chairperson of the session, I want to make a declaration that as organised labour, Minister, we come in peace. We have absolutely no intention of leaving here in pieces. When we had embraced the process of a just transition, not just a just energy transition, but speaking about the transitions in terms of the holistic perspective, and Minister Creasy, I almost made the mistake of going into that process of identifying the ministers, because I remember Minister Vali Musa many moons ago at Parliament in the very same capacity. So it is an absolute fit for purpose in terms of the presence here. But when we speak about organised labour, when we speak about the fact that organised labour was instrumental in the Just Transition Pact that was signed 11 years ago, taking this entire process full circle, we want to emphasize without fear, favour or contradiction that when we advance on this narrative, the intent is to leave nobody behind. When we speak about a just transition, justice must prevail in every single sense of the word. For every new job that must be created, in terms of the offset of the previous process, we must ensure that this particular process, chairperson of the session, is encompassed with a transition that embraces skills. We cannot force our people into a system where they are not upskilled, where they are not reskilled, where they are not prepared for what the future entails. We cannot be setting up our people for failure. We have seen advancement. We have seen technology embraced and encompassing every single new development, but we must ensure that we place priority at that system likewise. The future is there. The future is now. We have already seen the challenges of how we have shot ourselves in the foot. The global world is already speaking about a fifth industrial revolution, and we haven't even begun to properly engage and advance on the third industrial revolution. We are speaking about a knowledge-based economy. We are speaking about technology, artificial intelligence, and many other aspects. But how do we even begin to catch up? And this brings me to the specific points, chairperson of the session. When we're dealing with this transition and the investments that is linked to it, chairperson, I want to emphasize, and this is the part where the pieces comes into being, and we leave the piece behind just for a little bit. When we start with the engagements, it must be founded and grounded in the principles of trust. Without trust, we cannot move this bus and this humongous elephant forward. And when I say that on the principle of leaving nobody behind, I say this with tears in my eyes to everybody on the platform. When the Just Energy Transition Plan was presented to us, was tabled to us, it was already presented to the globe. We are not spectators. We are not here to critique, or we are not here to deliver, construct or destruct every time, honourable ministers. We are here as partners, because with every single step of a transition on a two-pronged approach, whether it be from a perspective of advancing on technology, whether it be on advancing on the perspectives of justice, we have to ensure that amongst ourselves, first and foremostly, we have the trust factor. South Africa is known to have this deficit of trust on many factors. I don't want to go into history where, the media is informed about it, but the social partners know absolutely nothing of it. Then the tug of war continues. And we have to leave that narrative behind. Program Director, I keep on saying Minister. Forgive me.
Round up also.
So ultimately, when we're dealing with trust, we cannot be presenting to the world when South Africa and all its social partners do not have insight into what is happening. And it goes back to my notion of leaving nobody behind. If we are going to engage, it has to be meaningful, it has to be transparent. We cannot engage, and it comes back to the notion of the nationally determined contributions that the program director had alluded to earlier on. When we speak about those nationally determined contributions, we have to take a pause and take a few steps backwards, because the world has outpaced South Africa and we have to balance the pace. Because we cannot say that we are going to pen our signatures, and my apologies, my esteemed colleague from NEDLAC. As organised labour, as Vedusa in particular, we cannot just have a blanket approach to say we fully support the recommendations. There are certain elements that we have to address, and we have to find consensus in terms of how we take it forward. We've got to take a pause. And lastly, Program Director, it is a matter that we have to get right, either way we look at it. Minister Creasy, Minister Godan, Minister Ramokgopa, there's just complete disconnect and disalignment between government policy. We cannot be talking left and walking right at all given stages. The one ministry's got huge ambitions, the other one's got a slight pullback factor. If we are going to engage in terms of where South Africa should be, because even though the world and even ourselves have got a narrative out there that says we don't have the capacity, it's a big fat lie. We are losing our vital skills components to the likes of the United Arab Emirates and the West almost on a daily basis because we do not have faith in ourselves and we do not have the proper processes in place when it comes to management and leadership. The skills is there. Let us stop losing those vital skills that can plow and plunge our South African economy into a new trajectory. And I believe that the labour component has a vital role to play in terms of their contributions towards the discussion. So Minister, Programme Director, when you give the microphone to organised labour, it's a little bit of a challenge to constrain ourselves. But thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Programme Director, Honourable Ministers, PCC members, civil society, or protocol observed. Pope Francis said this: we must hear the cry of the poor, and we must hear the cry of the earth. As people of faith, we are committed to stand for the poor and the marginalized. Proverbs 31 verse 8 says, we must speak up for those who are voiceless, for the rights of the poor and needy. And so we must talk about health. The voiceless are those people whose health is impacted by air pollution. We must speak up for the old lady who is coughing her lungs out in the early morning, the child who cannot go to school because of asthma, the breadwinner who loses his job because he has lung cancer. In March 2022, a South African court declared air pollution in Mpumalanga to be a breach of the residents' constitutional rights. Air pollution is a human rights issue. COVID killed a total of 6.8 million people globally. Every year, 8 million people die of air pollution. Because the majority are poor and vulnerable, the world does not seem to care. And as faith communities, we will stand up, we will speak up and demand that the minimum emission standards be complied with. Secondly, we must talk about finances. The Western Cape alone has just cut its health budget by 3 billion rand. And one of the things that is stated is because we are bailing out Eskom. Healthcare, education, crime prevention will be impacted if we continue to pour money into extending the life of ancient coal-fired power stations. We know that there is funding available for renewables at a very low cost. Bid window 6 was oversubscribed, and there is virtually no funding available for coal. It is said that the Stone Age did not come to an end because we ran out of stones, but because we found something better. It is the same with coal. We have found something cleaner, safer, and now it has become cheaper. And what of our businesses, battered by COVID, battered by load shedding, and now they will face being excluded from international markets, who are introducing carbon border taxes to stop the import of products from carbon-intensive economies like ours. We cannot take on new nuclear, which would lock us into devastating debt. Faith communities have already taken us to court about nuclear, and we would do it again. It is not a choice between coal and load shedding. The choice is between expensive energy and cheap energy, between coal and healthcare, education, and crime prevention. Secondly, we must hear the cry of the earth. We must talk about climate change. Day zero brought Cape Town to its knees. 1 year ago, Durban was battered by a rain bomb that killed over 400 people and caused 17 billion rands worth of damage. We must recognize our contribution to climate change. Our per capita carbon emissions are on a par with Europe. Our electricity is some of the dirtiest on this planet. That is injustice. We are not only impacting on our own citizens, but on our neighbors. Malawi was devastated this year by flooding, Mozambique by cyclones, supercharged by warming oceans. This is injustice. We must recognize intergenerational injustice. We owe a debt to the future generations. A poster at a climate change march said, "You will die of old age. We will die from climate change." We cannot betray the younger generation by betraying our nationally determined contribution to combating climate change. And we must talk about truth. The truth will set you free. There is corruption, and it must be uncovered. This last week has been a very sacred one for faiths in South Africa. We're celebrating Ramadan, Passover, and Easter. One of the key beliefs of Easter is that from death comes life. Sometimes you have to go down into the very darkest tomb in order for new life to come. We are in that dark place now as we hit level 6 load shedding with a bleak winter ahead. But new life is coming. Last month, in March alone, 31 projects with a capacity of 1,300 megawatts were registered. That is 8 times the amount that we received in the entire year of 2021 in 1 month. Change is happening, and it can quickly become exponential if we reduce red tape and barriers. Can we be visionaries of this new life? Can we see South Africa become a leading producer of electric taxis, electric buses, creating an efficient public transport system, exporting them across Africa? Can we see every TVET college offering courses on renewable energy? Can we see huge hubs, not just installing solar panels, but producing them so we do not need to import? Can we see huge firms being set up for factories in Mpumalanga and Highveld, producing wind energy turbines, creating jobs, creating hope for young people? The oil industry spawned the 1%ers. It spawned massive inequality. Decentralized energy production can bring the profits of energy back to the people. We can see rooftop solar panels on every school, every community hall, every church, every mosque, feeding into the grid and creating sustainable income for generations to come. We have young minds. We have bright minds. Let us harness them. And I would like to end with a quote by a woman of incredible stubborn hope, Christiana Figueres, the midwife of the Paris Agreement, who said this: "Know that you are incredibly lucky to be alive at a time when you can make a transformative difference to the future of life on Earth. You are not powerless. Your every action is suffused with meaning, and you are part of the greatest chapter of human achievement in history."
Program Director, good morning and thank you. Honorable Ministers present here, Minister Pravin Kotel, Minister Tracy, Minister Ramkhopa, members of the PCC, commissioners, delegates of the Colloquium, good morning, members of media. I am representing South African Local Government Association. And we have noted the recommendation by the PCC as South African Local Government Association. all of us, we know that municipalities are frontline providers of core infrastructure services, which recommend that we have to take this into account, all of us. In everything that we do, we need to take care of municipalities. I heard my fellow panelists speaking that municipalities are not going to be able to provide the free basic services. And it's a notion that needs all of us. You are not, as municipality, just giving free basic services to anybody that is not registered. That's the first point that we want to make. People has to register for the free basic services. It's not only electricity, but equally the water. Now, it cannot be just done for the sake of doing it. There is a funding that comes from national coffers for that particular service. So it is not our responsibility alone. That is why we have the intergovernmental relations, where provincial, national, and local government works together to render services that are efficient and effective to our own communities. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. And then we also wanted to bring to the attention that SALGA has acknowledged the transition. And we are aware that this transition is not avoidable, but it has to be just, so that it does not bring municipality to be worse from what they are today, but it must take into consideration that the new jobs must be created, the current jobs that are available must be protected. It must also deal with poverty, because we cannot let our people to be poverty-stricken from what they are today. Equally, we are saying if the just energy transition is not just, we as municipality will face more vandalism, will face more under-collection in terms of revenue, because us as municipality, our revenue comes from selling of electricity. And our homes will be attacked by communities because they don't know PCC, they don't know anybody else, they only know local government. So our lives as the sphere of local government will be in danger. So we support the just energy transition, but we also bring into the account the issue of these following provinces, your Mpumalanga, your Eastern Cape, to say those people there, they must also be well provided with this energy transition. Everything that we are doing as local government, the first instance that we are doing, in anything that we are doing, we take care of our own communities. Nobody will speak better for us and our communities than us as a sphere of local government. When those people are stricken by disaster, we are the first one to respond. And the South African Disaster Management Act gives that particular responsibility to province and national. Even the funding thereof, it goes there. So we are the ones that are at the cold face for everything. So we are saying here that we support everything that is going to help us to be better off. We are also saying that the demand for just energy transition must also look into account so that we are not worsening off. We are all aware that from November, all the meters that we are having as local municipality will be phased off. We must be ready as the sphere of local government to be able, so that tomorrow nobody says to us, what did you do as a sphere of local government? We are also saying to everybody here today to say energy supply, it is not anybody's business, but it's the local government's business, because it has negative impact on us. Businesses will die, and us as local government won't have revenue. So we are saying to everybody, please support us. Let's support the just energy transition so that all of us, we are better off, because there is nothing that we are going to do. It must take care of our own climate change equally, because anything that we do must also look into climate change conditions. Our municipalities must be climate change resilient. But we are also saying we need to be helped as sphere of local government to capacitate our own people in terms of the just energy transition that is coming to effect, because we have officials in the local sphere of government. In the budget that is there, we want our structure that will help and capacitate our own people that are there, because this is a new change that our people are not clued with. So we want everybody to support us as local government. And then the other fact is that as when we choose this energy transition, the pathway provided by Security of Energy Supply that takes into account our climate change commitment and the need to grow the economy, because it must not come and make us worse off, as and when we are stricken by disasters, our municipality and the whole South Africa is nowhere to be found, because all of us, we have seen what happened in Port Shepstone, all of us, we have seen what happened in KZ. Equally, we have seen what happened in Malawi, in Mozambique. So we are saying, as a sphere of local government, we are in full support of everything that is going to be just for the local municipality. But our communities, our women in particular, because they are the worst ones that have been stricken by all this from the regime of before 1994 till today. Women were worse off. Children are worse off, even the youth. Even today, our women are not taken care of. When there are opportunities, women are on the sideline, they are not involved. So we are saying, we are lobbying and advocating for our women in our municipality to be empowered and be in a better position in everything that is going to happen. Our women in our own communities, because they are the sole providers in their own communities. So all these things must happen in a just way. That's what we are saying. And fundamentally, local government agree and support the fact that the energy efficiency and demand side management are easy. It should not be a short term, and it should not be a quick win. We must all be taken into account so that all of us, we bring our heads together and we are able to do everything that is good. SALGA has conducted a study to check what are the implications of the load shedding in local municipalities. And what we have found out is that all the businesses are moving out in our municipalities. All municipalities are now worse off from what they were before. So nobody must point fingers to municipalities to say municipalities are not doing this, because the budget has been cut. And it is not only at local sphere of government. We as the local sphere of government, we are expected to collect revenue. 90% of revenue must come from us. We are only giving 10% from the national sphere of government. So we are pleading with everybody here to say, work with us as the local government sphere, and let's walk the talk. Let's not come here and make some unfounded statement, but let's walk the talk. All of us here, we belong to local government. We belong to wards that needs to be better off. Let us not come here and lash the local government, but let's help local government to be a better sphere of government for the betterment of all South Africans. I thank you.
Good morning, Deputy Chair of the Commission, fellow panelists, my colleagues from government, and ladies and gentlemen from... That's just to acknowledge that we're doing the right things. I agree with a lot of what my fellow panelists have said, but I want to make 5 broad points. But before I get into that, one of the biggest factors, which the first speaker pointed out, that's missing is a real feel for what social justice means in a practical sense. And there are many of us who for decades have worked towards social justice. But today we are being undermined in that process, and we are not taking the kind of courageous stands that we need to take when greed and corruption is undermining the search for social justice in South Africa, but in the world more broadly as well. And so much of our energy is about how do I advance myself rather than how do I advance all the people, both of South Africa and the world more generally. And I think this theme, Deputy Chairperson of the Commission, must underpin much of what we are saying about climate change as well. There are nice words, nice concepts, and nice ideas. But below that, as I will point out in a moment, is the element of economic competition between countries. As one of my colleagues pointed out from the panel, Europe is using trade as a tool to fight developing countries and to ensure that we don't export what we used to export to those sorts of countries as well. But we are quiet as developing countries. We're not on the same competitive field. We don't show any muscle towards the developed world to actually command their attention. So yes, we are being pushed on climate change, and we're pushing ourselves as the PCC on climate change as well, and responding as South Africans should to what is an essential challenge for humanity as a whole, and for South Africans as a whole as well. But it happens on a very unequal playing field at the moment. So, Firstly, what are the areas of agreement? The areas of agreement is climate change is a huge danger to humanity. And that if we don't act in an urgent sense, but also in a consensual way, we will lose our opportunity to ensure that we place South Africa and Africa as a continent on the right kind of footing. That carbon emissions need to decrease is commonly accepted. How we do it, when we do it, and what mechanisms each country uses has become a lot more open today as a result of the war in Europe. And we need to take those factors into account in the South African context as well. We've also agreed almost a year ago that the electricity sector in South Africa is the biggest contributor to carbon emissions, over 40%. And that is why the focus is on the electricity sector to the extent that it is. And it played a major role in determining what the PCC came up with as the NDC for COP26. We also made a global commitment through Minister Creasy at COP26 and the President as well in terms of what South Africa will attempt to do and the kind of just energy transition path that we would actually follow. But we are also finding ourselves in a position where we need to more sharply distinguish between what is our strategic goal and what are the tactics that we're going to use to actually achieve the strategic goal. So the goal is very clear. We need, by 2050, to ensure that the global warming doesn't go beyond 1.5 degrees. How we get there has become a lot more complex as a result of both global developments and South African factors, which the Chair mentioned earlier on. So let's build on the areas of common agreement that we have. And then the second point is, what do we need further agreement on? So let's agree that the South African reality, as various speakers have described, needs to be more sharply taken into account. Secondly, we are and will remain as partners and as South Africans in this common fight that we actually have. Thirdly, let's make sure that we have a clear plan which will have to be adjusted from time to time. No plan lives for 30 years in the same form. It will have to take new contingencies, new developments, new technologies into account as we go forward. So nonetheless, let us have a plan building on the current reality, both the constraints and the opportunities that we have for a just energy transition in South Africa. But as many speakers have pointed out, planning is one thing. Doing something with that plan is quite another. And we, as a community of people who have common concerns, need to get some of our feet in the ground, attempt to bring about some of the changes that climate change demands of us, and from those changes we will learn what works and what doesn't work. If we sit in boardrooms like this all the time, we will have an academic discussion of a very high order, but we will not be able to impact on reality on the one hand, nor are we going to learn lessons about what actually works on the ground on the other hand as well. So I hope that at some stage we're going to find agreement that we need to get into action mode and what that actually means. But we also need to shout a lot louder, not only at the COP meetings, but in between those meetings as well, at the developed countries in respect of their responsibilities. And that voice is not being heard sharply enough from all of us. In other words, as was already raised, who is going to finance all of this? Where is the money going to come from? South Africa might have some additional capacity to many African countries or developing countries more generally, but it does not have the capacity to fund all of the changes that need to take place in relation to climate change. What responsibility is the developed world taking for funding climate change and adaptation programs that are needed more urgently in some of the island states, for example, compared to even the challenges that we have in South Africa? And we're not putting enough pressure in that sense. So there are areas, Chair, that we can find agreement on under your guidance as we go forward. And we've already started talking about rooftop solar and what the experiences of Vietnam are. And Mr. Ramakopa is becoming quite an expert on the Vietnamese story as well. The third point is energy security is important both in the short term and in the long term, as has been pointed out in the opening remarks. So we need to, at all stages, continuously keep in mind how are we going to meet the energy requirements, both of our citizens, small businesses, and big businesses as well, as we go forward. And take into account the current ESCOM reality, that it cannot, at this point in time, seem to consistently produce more than 23,000 or 24,000 megawatts, whereas the demand is closer to 30,000 and beyond almost every single day during peak hours. And what Minister Ramakopa is working on, and we are working on with him, is how do we cover that gap? Because that is an existential question as we sit today. It's not tomorrow's question. It's yesterday's question and today's challenge that we need to take into account. And the IRP 19 needs to be modified so that we take into account these new realities. But perhaps the most urgent thing is how do we get the quickest input of new megawatts into our system yesterday, if you like, because without 4,000 to 6,000 more megawatts availability of new energy as urgently as possible, we're not going to cope with the immediate requirements, whether it is at a local government level, at an industrial level, or at a household level as well. So that reality is certainly something that we need to work on. The fourth point is that there's a new global reality arising from the war in Europe. And they're quite comfortable making all sorts of zigzags in terms of their planning in relation to energy security and the just transition as well, but want to still dictate how we should do things and meet their requirements. Now, that discord between what we are required to do in order to get to world markets and also what they are required to do and are actually doing amounts to do what I tell you to do, not what I do. Right? And that's what Europe is telling us. Don't do what I do, just do what I tell you to do. And that is something that we must decide as South Africans whether that kind of lack of dignified approach to us is a justifiable one or not. But the reality is war has changed the energy scenario. It has changed the pathways to the kind of goals set at COP26 and 27, and that we have to take that reality into account as we work out the jet pathway in South Africa itself. Finally, the fifth point is that arising from this conversation and the discussions that we are having as partners, we need a clear road, if you like, or a South African road to energy security, and which incorporates a climate-safe planet and country as well. And amongst those things is back to the question, what's our strategic goal, but what are the tactical shifts we will have to make in trying to meet our strategic goal as we take account of the different contingencies that we actually require. We talk quite easily about tackling poverty, unemployment, and inequality in South Africa. But it's also time that we asked ourselves and challenged ourselves, what impact are we actually making, each of us, from the different constituencies that we come from, on reducing unemployment, on reducing inequality, and on reducing poverty? Because I don't think there's much of an impact in terms of the numbers of people who live in those conditions currently in South Africa, and which requires us to rethink the models that we are working with so that we have more impactful interventions than the ones that we currently have. And amongst the things that are getting in the way of making the impact is, as I said earlier on, the corruption factor from local government upwards and from small business to large businesses and in different parts of society as well. Each of us might be willing to bribe a police person or a traffic officer in order to avoid a fine. How many of us take a stand in that particular regard? To say, I will not pay you, you can give me your fine and I'll pay it. How many of us will resist the temptation to make money out of a particular transaction? And it's time that we confront that reality in South Africa and begin to challenge each other so that self-interest doesn't supersede people's interest at the end of the day. So, Chair, the most urgent task I think we have is to build the consensus that you are talking about and translate many of our plans into actionable steps so that we can start learning lessons. But in our experience and yours as well as an activist, it's united action that actually creates the unity that is required, not unity that creates united action. And that's the lesson as we celebrate 40 years of the United Democratic Front and its creation this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy Chairperson, members of the Cabinet of the Republic, commissioners of the PCC. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be seen, to be heard, and to be felt. I have a few talking points that I'm supposed to cover, but I think there's something that's very important to talk about in relation to the conversations that are going to be happening here. And that is the reality that young people, not just youth, but younger youth, high school going youth, school going youth, are absolutely terrified. We're absolutely terrified because all of the brain capacity in this room, many of you know each other, many of you have had these conversations, yet where have we gotten? We've seen, we've heard, we watched. Now we're seeing the future that we're going to get being completely squandered. Now, the question of corruption. Let's be very clear here. We as very young people recognize that small-scale corruption isn't the reason why we have a failing state utility and we're failing to respond to climate change and the economy is collapsing on itself. And many of us are told, if you want a prosperous future, don't look in South Africa, go to New Zealand, Australia, Britain, go to the West. That's not small-scale corruption, that's large-scale corruption. That's not happening on our level, but it's happening on a much higher level and a higher scale. Then the question of finance. I want to be very clear, and I've had this conversation with the commissioners before, and they've heard me on this, and I've had these conversations with many comrades from Debt for Climate, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, which is where I'm from today. I'm representing Youth at SIA and multiple other youth organizations. The question of finance is that really where we as young people are is that the transition in itself, if it's going to happen, it mustn't happen in a way in which the money that we're given will be crippling our ability to have a future and to develop South Africa into a nation that is able to cater for all who live in it. So that's to say that odious debt, even if the terms of the loans are concessional, the amount of money that we are given and how we're able to access that finance needs to be made more accessible. Following the First World... the Prime Minister of Barbados, Maya Motley, made a statement at one of the global goalkeeper events hosted by the Gates Foundation. Following the end of the First World War, Britain, Germany, and a few other allied nations borrowed huge sums of money to finance the war. They put it in a bond, and then they wrapped that bond up, and when they couldn't pay it in the 1930s, they put that bond into another bond, and they extended the term so they could pay it back over a long period of time. They took the loan out in the late 1920s. They only paid it back in 2014. Yet the terms and the access to finance that the Global South gets and that we in South Africa are going to be getting from the Global North, are the terms and are the durations of that payback consistent with the ability for us to not just implement a just transition, but to incorporate elements of justice into that? Because there can be no just high schooler who's supposed to be in history right now to have to trek all the way to Pretoria, sit next to a minister, more ministers, very intelligent people, and have to really, what I'm saying, tell the adults in the room to wake up and do something now. Now, I'm not saying that for applause. I sound nervous. That's because I am, and I'm scared. I'm not scared to be here, and I'm not nervous to be in front of you. I'm scared and I'm nervous for what's going to happen. We mustn't forget that this is a human issue. This is about lives here. We can look at what private sector wants. We can look at what different people in the global economic system want. But ultimately, we must recognize that when we're talking about dealing with climate change, it is a people-centered approach. It starts and ends with the people. And so, if it means I, as an activist in South Africa, must help coordinate a campaign in Washington to get the US Congress and President Biden, or in the UK to get Prime Minister Sunak, or wherever else in the world I have to communicate with other young activists to get their governments to change the terms with 1.5 and addressing climate change for the sake of what is really going to be short-term economic growth. I love the expression the Reverend used. The Stone Age did not end because of a shortage of stones. The current IRP brings on 1,500 megawatts of new coal capacity generation onto the grid. This conversation is obviously going to lead to a new one. And then we're going to talk about the fossil fuel industry to just gas. And then they're going to hold on to that. And then we're going to go from fighting coal to fighting gas. And then from there, where else do we go on to? What's next? The reality is that sustainable, renewable energy, your wind and your solar, are affordable. They are what we can access now in South Africa. The private sector wants policy. The private sector and private markets want policy predictability. Now, that policy predictability can still exist in a context where the ambitions and the targets that we set help us to get where we need to be. It would help them realign their position, gather the finance that they have, because rich people are always rich, and put it in the specific industries and areas where we need it. But I will underscore this. Keep Eskom in the mix for this transition. Is that the money must go from the people who are going to give it to us, from the global north, because they owe us that historical debt. The money must go from them directly to the institutions or companies that will be implementing the transition. And the former CEO of Eskom, Andre Treter, said himself, I don't want the money to touch Eskom. And I don't think any South African is comfortable with $8.5 billion US touching Eskom's coffers. But in closing, and I recognize in saying this statement from what we know about the way the minerals industrial complex works, I have made a lot of enemies, but that's fine. In closing, I want to quote Robert Kennedy. He was in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town speaking to another generation of young people who are fighting for another cause, many of them in our cabinet, many of them our grandparents. And he said to them that this world demands the qualities of youth, a quality of imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite of adventure over the life of ease. Young people today are willing to take bold, ambitious, radical decisions because, frankly, you can't threaten our lives when we're already fighting for our lives with climate change. So please, involve us in the conversation. There are a lot of brilliant young policymakers in this room. I urge you to find them. There are a lot of brilliant young activists here who can go in greater detail than I am. I am just a vessel for them. I didn't even tell you my name because my name doesn't matter. The fact that I'm sitting here on behalf of youth is what matters. You must bring us to the table of human society. It has always been the youth who have propelled us forward. in this dangerous time that we're in now, it would be a great, great error to leave young people out.
Thank you.
All protocols observed. Wow. And it's not only to say wow to what I'm just following, it's also because a lot has been said, right? And being from organized business, some of what I wanted to say is already reflected, but I want to just take a moment and appreciate the caliber of young people that South Africa is breeding, right? We have to. What I will say is nothing close to trying to say that we should be considering private sector as good or bad. What I'm going to talk to is the work that's been done. What I'm going to reflect on is the fact that we actually need to get to a point where we stop this antagonizing relationship that we have as South Africans. We're meant to be working together. When South Africa burns, it doesn't just burn one house, it burns everyone's house. Not just the building where there's a warehouse, not just where the factories are, it's also your house, my house, the school, the office building. It even burns down, our holy and even our revered places. So we need to take collective action. And this requires us to collaborate. And some of it is to swallow bitter pills of the stuff that has happened in the past. And I'm not talking about the previous dispensation. I'm talking about the relationship that we have as social partners. Now, business for a while has had a view around climate change to say it's happening in the future. But the realization through a lot of pushing from whether it's from youth, from civil society, even from academia, is that actually it's happening right now. And unfortunately, we are stuck in a situation as well where the transition is also occurring. We tend to look at the transition as being something that is about to happen, or we are just about to enter, but it's been happening for a while. And we have to start to say, when are we going to begin to do the things we said we're going to do? And some of those things are about just basic implementation. We've had good plans. We've gone from 2011 with the National Climate Change Response White Paper. We've been through 1998 with the White Paper on Energy. And those things were great. They were formulated by some of the people in this room, as you've also indicated, but we haven't implemented. So maybe as South Africans, we need to just kind of take a step back and say, let us implement what we have. And stop this idea of wanting to keep on doing more and more on top of more without having a basis or a foundation to which we should be implementing on or using as a... Now, the minister indicated, and I think the gravity of what he was saying doesn't sit in the room clearly, is that he basically said that we had capacity, or right now we've got capacity, probably 32 gigawatts, or rather we've got demand for 32 gigawatts, and at some point in time we either have 24 or 28 gigawatts of power that we can satisfy that demand. But we're moving from a situation where we thought we would be at 50 or 52. We're moving from a situation where at some point we had 44 gigawatts of energy readily available. Something is going on which is destroying our energy capacity, which is destroying our inherent capacity as a country. And it's not only about electricity, it's across the board. And I think you've heard as well, whether it's a situation in municipalities, whether it's a social situation, whether it's the behavior that we are exhibiting as society. Now, when it comes to climate change and the just transition, business took a step and said, look, we have to find a place in this craziness and this let's do the necessary work. Let's look at the different sectors in society which business participates in and say, how do we get to a point where electricity, manufacturing, construction, transport, all lead us towards a just transition to a net zero economy. Now, we had 10 takeaways from those. And I would like to reiterate them, and I'm very happy that the recommendations from the electricity document also reflect some of these, but I just wanted to mention them again. The first one is that we need to expand and enhance the electricity transmission grid. There is no way we're going to be able to get to net zero, and there is no way we're going to have a multi-competitive market without a functioning, stable transmission grid, which is also fit for purpose for bi-directional and the multitudes of the kinds of services that it needs to provide. We don't need 4 to 6 gigawatts of renewable energy. We need 3 times more. We need to roll out an aggressive program of new capacity and as well as peaking capacity, be it gas, be it pump storage, which is fit for purpose for that time. In the context of moving into a net zero, we understand that electricity is just but a component, and it's also encouraging that everyone is reflecting that. The railway system that we have and the infrastructure needs to be enhanced, and it needs to be made fit for purpose in line with moving a large portion of society towards modal shift, meaning that we need to be using more public transport. We need to electrify. This is in turn going to allow us to do 2 things. One, reduce the cost of transportation, and the other one is to decarbonize, because that is also an ultimate aim. In that, it also addresses the spatial planning concern that we have. And that's one of the recommendations that come out of the electricity recommendations, is that we need to highlight. Then the last 3 I would like to just touch on is that in the broader scope of society, we need to be looking at our nutrition as much as possible. And I know the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment is here. When we look at the national communications and how we're calculating our greenhouse gases, we use kit labs concerning a sustainable and nutritious diet that's leading us into a direction where we're no longer having high emissions associated with our agriculture. And a key component of our recommendations towards this electricity framework is that we need to act now. We need to implement. There's no more time for talking. We need to implement, and we need to go so that we are able to front run the transition to a net zero economy. And one of the last areas, Chair, that I would like to just point out from the recommendations that we also have on our own is that we can't run away from the international standards. We can't run away from the international movement towards decarbonization. The whole world is undergoing a transition. The thing that's happening in Europe is just a blip in a transition. And we can't use that as an excuse to move backwards. South Africa can, between the different groups of society, we might be left behind internationally. And that's not a place that we need to go to. Over, Chair.
Thank you very much. Those have been absolutely wonderful and to-the-point contributions. I did allow it to go on because I think all of the contributions were really adding to the reason why we are here. So thank you very much for that. Thoughtful contributions. And it also gives us a very good idea of the thinking and the interests of the different social groups. I think it comes across very, very clearly, which is what we want. So thank you for that. I wonder if any of the panelists want to come back after having heard the others say something, or say something to each other, or ask a question to each other, or something of that sort. Hopefully not, but, and those of you that have spoken at length should come in last then on this one, but GS.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I'm going to try not to say things tongue-in-cheek here. I've heard a lot, and I'm glad Minister is back in the hot seat. Minister Gordon speaks about the tactical shifts we have to make. Now, some of those tactical shifts within the room, I've spoken, and I deliberately had an opening statement that says we got to look at skilling, upskilling, and reskilling. I sit with a hat on from organized labor with a direct mandate to protect jobs, to create new jobs, and to advance on what the capabilities are for us to be competitive as South Africa. Now, I don't want to disagree with the statement that we've got brilliant minds in the room, especially from our youth component, but let us also not be subjected to institutional capture. Let us also not fall into the traps of others that have set targets for us, as Minister Praveen has so eloquently outlined. Do what we do, don't ask the questions, just follow. We are not here to be followers, we are here to be leaders. But the point that I wish to make is that as much as we've got brilliant young minds in the room here, the youth representative spoken eloquently, and I want to compliment you for that. But let this not be an academic fora that is subjected only to us also promoting capture. Because where are our youth from Hammanskraal? Where are our youth from Langa, Kailicha? Where will they become involved in these conversations, ladies and gentlemen? Because if they are going to be left behind, what does it then say for us? The world knows what the report and the recommendations are outlining, but does the broader civil society know what is being outlined? How are we supposed to convince our own constituencies if we also have fallen short of some of the targets? Now, the specific point I come to, Minister, is the fact that when we talk about skills, we should also couple it with a localization agenda. We have deliberately forgotten about that because we believe that the West and this Europhobic, this Eurocentric agenda that we have, that the Europeans and the West are more intelligent than what we are. Can we please unlearn that now and let go of that concept?
Thank you.
Solar panels do not just have to be procured from across the borders of South Africa. And Minister Gordon has mentioned it earlier on to say, when we talk about these elements, how do we advance it in terms of our contributions towards job creation, the elimination of poverty, and equally so inequality? Minister, as the second largest trade union federation in South Africa, I know it's a meager drop in the ocean, but we have contributed something like 36 million towards the localization agenda. Now, if we can do it, why can't everybody else do it? Why are you going to be procuring and looking towards the outside when we have businesses that have crippled as a result of load shedding, when we have had workers that have been subjected to massive Section 189 processes as a result of load shedding? We are not saying that this is your legacy, but we are saying we have constituents that are bleeding, Minister. We have the ability. Let us not leave a legacy behind that the youth have to take forward. We can do this together. Please look at the localization agenda. We have the ability to unlock many. I'm not going to engage on the other portions because I know that the program director is going to muffle me. So I thought it's extremely important. Let us take stock of our own and unlearn those habits that only the outside is better than what we can. Thank you.
You know, we have such eloquent speakers here on the panel. And just to take a short 1-minute break and to educate those of you who also act as master and mistresses of ceremony from time to time. Normally what happens, you have eloquent speakers and then the MC, who people themselves have done. And so that's why I'm not trying to summarize. I can't say it the way people have said it. We don't have much time left. We're running out of time. If there's anything urgent to be said, you can say it. I know all of you want to speak, especially with the wonderful response you're getting and you're generating from the audience. It is very tempting to continue speaking. Even the Reverend was getting a rousing welcome from all of you. They're not used to that. They're not used to that, you know, with their congregations who sit there a bit more glum than all of you. So just very quick, Happy, quick. Yeah.
No, Chair, I think what we need to do, all of us at least at some point, is to agree what the hymn sheet is. We can't move forward if we are moving from different points of departure. We are clear, all of us, that the targets that have been set in South Africa are South African targets. It's an NDC. We nationally determined our own contribution. There was an extensive period of engagement and consultation that led us to that point. There were negotiations after a couple of years and saying, those are not our targets. Then whose targets are those? Because we were there, blood, sweat, and tears, the department working really hard. So that's our point of departure, that these are our targets. How do we reach those targets? We can't be moving backwards, we should be moving forward. And the closing line here, Chair, is that we need to work together. And each person or each role player or person has a role to play. Each social partner has a role to play, and we need to play our roles in the manner in which we're supposed to, not trying to infringe on others. So it's not business who's a policymaker, right? But we can talk to the policymakers to say, let the environment be right. It is not labor that is a policymaker. It will talk and ensure that the conditions are right. And we need to ensure ourselves as well that when we are talking together in South Africa, we agree. When we go outside into the outside world or we go into the international world, we speak with one voice. Because this thing of mixed messages does not only hurt our credibility as a country, it also hurts our sustainability. Because we lose this level of prominence that we've had. And one example of that is the Jet IP. The longer we take without fixing and getting on with the Jet IP, we're going to be overtaken.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Happy. Thank you for that.
Deputy Chair?
Yes, Otsila, I know you want to speak, but you're the only person for whom I've got a question. So I'd like you to answer the question. I'm sure you got a lot on your mind. You made a point which I hear the youth speaker in these sorts of sessions all make the same point, that old people have run out of ideas, that they are not the ones that are going to inherit the future, that if you talk about corruption, it's not young people who are corruption, it's us, the old people, who are the corrupt. All of that is correct. And then you say, and then your punchline is, give young people a chance. Give us a chance. We're capable, we're intelligent, etc., etc. Now, my question is, why is that question being asked? Because, you know, in the struggle against apartheid, from the 1976 uprisings onwards, young people brought down the apartheid regime. They were not asking the older people for permission. Give us a chance to fight against apartheid. Give us a chance to bring down the regime. They were doing it. And what is the psychology of this thing where young people are not taking charge? They're waiting for older people to vacate their seats. You're going to wait forever. Maybe not that long, because older people won't last that long. But you're going to wait for a long time, because people don't vacate their seats. And why is it that young people are not taking the charge? I looked at an interesting statistics the other day from Stats South Africa. It's a few years old, 2019. If you look at the South African age cohort, 2/3 of all South Africans, of the entire population, is under the age of 34. 2/3. And 1/3 of the entire South African population is under the age of 14. 1/3. So people like, you know, the MC of this meeting are really a rarity in a minority. And those are the people that should be taking charge. And many of the people that I speak to, of my sort of colleagues and old comrades and all, They say, what's wrong with the young people? Why are they not taking charge like we did? So you ask, give us why you're not allowing us to take charge. And the young people of today are useless. They're not taking charge. They're not interested. They should be taking over. Just talk to me a little bit about why are you guys not taking over? I mean, are we that scary? I mean, really?
A very important distinction there is, let me start with this. I don't know which young people you've been talking to, but the ones I know are taking charge. The ones I know are taking charge. But what's important, and I hope it addresses the question, there's a key difference. Your job was to your generation toppled an entire system, toppled an entire government that was oppressing the majority of the people in this country. We are fighting a government that is supposed to be supporting us. And I won't, you know, I'm very careful to talk for the majority because I know there'll always be a few that'll say, but personally, the way I see it, my family was in the resistance to apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement. So for me to have to come to the immediate decision that no, I need to take the minister out of his seat and put someone else here. I need to drag the ANC out of government in a very, very, I said a party's name, sorry. I have to drag certain individuals out of power. It's not just, but let's be serious about this. It's not just one party. It's an entire system. It's a system-wide rot that exists. And so young people, maybe you don't see us active in that sphere because we're talking amongst ourselves, actually saying, what does our 1994, which is 2024, what is that supposed to look like? And that's what we're doing at the moment. That's what in high school right now, I'm the executive director of a youth nonprofit, a youth voting advocacy group that is going to register, that is planning to register a lot of Gen Zs ahead of the 2024 election because we recognize that maybe you think that we aren't engaging the political system, but behind the scenes, watch 2024 and watch what happens. But my last point is this. Okay. Breathe regular, everyone, don't worry. You people, that does not mean I don't want to talk to you. Because whether I like to admit it or not, the ministers in cabinet, the people in this room who are commissioners, you all have a level of experience that I and other young people will only attain after having done the job for a while. I'm not against you. I am not the enemy. I may sound like I want to drag you out, and I may sound like I am against you. What I want you to take away is that youth are leading. We're not leading where you're watching. We're leading where it's important for other young people to see us leading. We're preparing ourselves. And the second thing to note after this is that, yes, we're upset, and yes, we will say it to you directly. But that does not mean you and I are enemies. I personally believe that if I had to sit down with Minister Godan, the commissioners of the PCC, Minister Creasy, Minister Ramkhopa, even you, Deputy Chair, if we had to sit down for an hour and have a conversation, we'll find out that there's far more that unites us than that which divides us.
Thank you.
And I hope I answered.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If there was a younger person, I would have given that person a chance, but I think we're going to end at that because that's a message of hope and the response, Otsile, that you're getting from this audience. People are agreeing with you and you give them hope and tell your colleagues that the people here really want to be led by young people. You can see that here. They want to be led by young people. You've got my vote. I know
I'm
my
not running
vote is
for
secret,
anything.
but I'm going to
I'm not
vote
running
for
for
you.
anything.
I'm going to vote for you. Minister Ramokgopa, the SG that I'm going to vote for Tsile. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to ask Minister Creasy to come up and say a few words, mainly in response and summarizing what we've heard here. And then once she is done, then I'm going to hand over to the Secretariat, and all I have to say is thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Chair of the Climate Commission. And let me acknowledge my fellow ministers, our panel that I think was really fascinating to listen to, and all of you ladies and gentlemen who've taken time out of your busy lives to join this important colloquium today. You know, to speak after Valley it's what they call in politics receiving a poisoned chalice. Because you heard all the nasty things he said that ministers and chairpersons do when they come up onto the stage and they try to summarize a conversation more worse than the speakers did. And I hate to tell you that this morning, before I came here, he told me, together with Crispin, that, look, just summarize the key points of the discussion. So, you want ahead? I'm putting it on the block. Let me try and pull together a few ideas which I think our panel, everybody agreed on. So the first issue that everybody agreed on is that as we move forward with the discussion on the Just Transition Investment Plan and on the future of the Integrated Resource Plan, we must affirm what science tells us. We must affirm that already global temperature has risen by 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial times. We must affirm that it would be better to keep global temperature increases to South Africa's duty as a member of the UNFCCC to contribute our best effort to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that was the first issue that everybody was agreed upon. The second issue that everybody agrees on, but this is where it becomes complicated, is the question of climate justice. And I think what was interesting in the debate is that there is a debate, well, there shouldn't be a debate around this, it's a fact. Who caused the climate of science and fact? But what is contested is who's going to pay to put it right. And who is going to pay when those who have had the least effect on the causes are going to be those who will carry of climate justice is who is going to carry the risks of the transition and who is going to benefit from the transition. And I think in this regard, there are really three areas that we have to look at. The first is the tension between developed and developing countries. So suppose if one wants to understand the origins of the jet investment plan, the origins come from the offer that was made by some of the developed countries at COP26 to start to provide financing for the transition in South Africa. Now that offer, in my view, is part of the obligations that those developed countries carry as a result of their being signatories to the Paris Agreement and as a result of their having caused the problem that we face at the moment. They're not doing us any favors. It's part of their obligation. The question then arises in the South African domestic context, who will benefit from this financing? And I think the panel has spoken very eloquently about the fact that there are those and communities in the coal value chain, those who are subsistence agriculturalists, women and their families, all of those sections of our society that are going to be impacted on by climate change and who are going to carry the risks of the transition. And there's a very strong voice coming that those communities, those South African communities, must be beneficiaries of the transition. And they must be beneficiaries not just in terms of the projects and programs themselves, but the society as a whole must benefit from new forms of industrialization and wealth creation that will help us deal with our triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Powerful voice that came from Utsile, talking about the intergenerational climate justice issues. So interesting, Utsile, that you used the post-war loans as an issue. Because I think for my generation, one is critically aware that the prosperity is based on the very carbon-intensive industrialization that will create an absolute disaster for your generation. And I think that when we talk about the climate issue, those of us, many of us in the room who are of my generation, we do need to approach this issue with humility. Because our children and our grandchildren are going to pay a very different type of debt. It's not just going to be a monetary debt to the one that our generation had to pay for the wars of the early part of the 20th century. The third issue that I think we all agree on, the context of a major energy crisis in our country. And I think that it's very helpful to talk about what the International Energy Council refers to as the energy trilemma. So that energy security is accessible to everybody in society at an affordable price. And how do you do it in a way that is not only environmentally sustainable, but also... And so, as we consider the way forward, I think the panel was talking about the fact that there does need to be an aggressive onslaught of new on stream quickly. It has to be affordable. It has to be available for everybody. And it needs to meet the sustainability criteria. And that is what makes it such a very difficult problem to solve. Special mention was made of the role of local government. And I think it's terribly important as we move forward in our plans around the transition to think long and deep and hard about the role of local government. Local government has historically been the energy receive our energy not directly from Eskom but from our local authority. Local government is directly dependent on revenue from electricity, from selling on electricity. So as we think about energy reform, if we don't want to further collapse local government, we have to think about the revenue stream of local government in the context of different forms of energy generation. And then we know that in South Africa, because we're a mega biodiverse country and because we've got a full spectrum of climate impacts, drought, sea level rise, wildfires, heat waves, floods, all of the above. It's great to be a mega biodiverse country. Building resilience is, at the end of the day, something that has to happen at a local level, and the way in which we build resilience is going to be different in different parts of the country. Now, what I heard Utsila saying, and it brings me towards the conclusion of our discussion, is that debate and discussion is good and important for building consensus, but implementation is urgent. The 6th IPCC report has told us that we need to act in this decade, thinking about implementation. And so, as we move towards implementation, we need a plan. And we need a plan that we are all going to agree on. Now, the General Secretary said something interesting. She said that that plan must be based on trust. And I suppose the question we have to consider is, how do you build trust? And my view is that trust can only be built in action. We've agreed on a just transition framework. But that framework is only going to have reality when we start to implement it in practice. And so I suppose the question we now need to discuss is, if there are plans through the JET IP to upgrade the grid, what does inclusion look like in practice in the process of upgrading the grid, of implementation? And it's a very interesting question, because there are other countries that have successfully achieved elements of a just transition. Spain is one such country, Germany is another such country, but both of those countries are developed countries. And in a way, we are the first developing country that is experimenting with this model. I would want to suggest that instead of different sectors debating with each other about what we don't know and what we don't understand, what we actually need to be doing, all of us, is starting to learn. So, what are elements of this inclusive practice that we can learn from Spain and Germany that could be appropriate to South Africa? What can business learn about justice? What can the youth learn about the economy? How can labor, organized labor, help us with this vision of reskilling, upskilling, and creating new jobs? Because I would want to suggest you can't just be advisors, you've got to become the practitioners. And how does government learn and get the alignment right? Reverend Marsh, I really loved your quote from Christina Figueres. We are not powerless, but we don't have time. Can we roll up our sleeves and get moving? As my favorite shoemaker would say, let's just do it. Thank you very much.
You can leave now.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Nichols. I work in the Secretariat and have been leading some of these stakeholder engagements. And I'm just going to quickly introduce the breakout groups and then release you for a break. But I wanted to make a quick comment on my experience having been involved in these stakeholder engagements over the last year. And the first one is we all want the same thing. We're all after social justice and justice for people. And so we're all on the same team fighting for the same goal. And the second is, and it really came out so beautifully in the panel, is this is a conversation about optimism and stubborn hope. There is a better pathway. There is a pathway that gets us more prosperity for all people in South Africa, and that's really what we're about. And so the stakeholder breakout groups are our first opportunity to start exploring this and how we build trust through action, starting to get to some of the solutions that support the recommendations. And also an opportunity, as the Minister said, to learn from each other. I have no idea where to point this. Okay, we just advance to the second slide. Next one. Next slide. Am I doing it? Is someone else doing it? Other way. And grid expansion, so that's the details around the energy mix. How do we build in transparency into planning? What is the role of spatial planning, as the recommendations put? How do we focus on where there's already available capacity on the grid? How do we anchor on least cost? What are our least cost options? What short-term governance measures do we need? What's the role of distribution? One of the things that came out of the panel and in our discussions is the role of local government and the distribution. The second group is looking at electricity governance, access and planning. What's the role of the state in electricity? What's the role, as we transform into different systems, how does the role of the state change? What are the needs of local government, an important theme? What kind of governance reforms and market mechanisms do we need? What's the role of free basic electricity? How do we equality, but also around food security? What's the influence of crime and corruption? What do we need to do about that? And what other social protection measures are needed to help support people in vulnerable value chains? Third breakout group, localization, jobs and skills. How do we drive localization? How do we manage this industrial planning? Where do we do this? What are the spatial components of it? How do we use this planning to forecast job needs and therefore skills? What are the procedural justice elements? I think that also came out very strongly. How do we involve communities in the planning that affects their lives as well as workers? What kind of labor market reform do we need, and what are the social ownership approaches? I think that came up in the panel, but probably needs more emphasis. How do we transfer wealth and capital from people who have it to people who don't? And then finally, the last group is on finance and just energy transaction, the role of the JET IP and donor funding, as we've discussed in the panel. What are the sort of local governance, finance, and business models needed? What kind of institutional capacity do we need to absorb grant investment, how do we think about blending and the various roles of the private and the public sector? What's the role of National Treasury? How do we increase grant support? It was clear from the panel that this is something that is needed. And so these are all very exciting. I'm sure that you have no idea which group to go to. I'd like to go to all of them myself. But just to give you a sense of where they are, the first group looking at electricity planning will stay in this room. We'll come back to this room, the diamond room. The group looking at electricity governance, access and poverty will go to the ruby room, which is on the ground floor. The third group, looking at localizing jobs and skills, will be in the crystal room, which is upstairs. And then the last group will go to the amethyst room, which is on the lower ground. And each group will have a commissioner who will facilitate. There'll be a short presentation just to get the conversation going. I'm sure we'll need all of the time that we have. And then there'll be a rapporteur helping to put it all together. After lunch, we'll come back and start to talk in plenary. So we're really looking to your broader input. Thank you to Vali for an excellent first session. It was very inspiring. Thank you all. If we can please start at 11:45, we will start the breakout groups promptly. Thank you, everybody.